From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Dallas Peterson goes over the updated regulations on dicamba herbicide applications to resistant soybeans in the wake of ongoing drift issues associated with that soybean production system. We'll also hear from K-State's Erick DeWolf. He addresses a topic that he's been discussing with certified seed growers and others in the Kansas wheat production sector, the possibility of trouble with stem rust disease, as a number of susceptible varieties are now being grown fairly widely across the Central Plains. Later on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton talks about conducting a garden soil test ahead of the growing season. All this and more next on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. As always, we're glad to have you aboard. We're returning to the subject of dicamba herbicide applications to Kansas soybean crops. And as you producers are well aware, this has been quite a situation the last 2 or 3 years, not only in the state of Kansas, particularly other states to our east and our south. But what we wanted to do today is catch up on dicamba regulations in Kansas and what you producers need to know heading into this growing season. As you would suspect, our guest has been on the receiving end of many questions on this subject. He is Dallas Peterson, Weed Management Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. It would pay to go back and recap the circumstances concerning dicamba applications and inadvertent off-target drift, Dallas.
Well, certainly so. And, of course, dicamba is not new. We've been using it for over 50 years, and especially in the western half of the state. And we always knew off-target problems could exist and have existed through the years, but it really come to the forefront with the introduction of the Xtend soybeans and Xtend cotton as well, but especially the soybeans, which meant that we started using it in and around proximity of other susceptible soybeans, and that's when we again really increased the number of incidents of non-target injury from dicamba. So that first started in 2017 with the introduction of Xtend soybeans and the 3 new labeled products for use on Xtend soybeans. That's Xtend Max, Fexapan, and Ingenia. They introduced those products because they were lower in volatility, and that should help reduce the potential for vapor drift. But still, we had major issues that first year out. So there were major changes to the label in 2018. It was reclassified as a restricted use pesticide. The first year it was not. It also had a requirement of dicamba or auxin-specific training for anybody making that application. So you had to be a certified applicator to purchase those products, although technically you didn't have to be a certified applicator to apply those products. If you got the training, you could still do that under the direct supervision of a certified applicator. So maybe a little bit of a loophole there. Again, it was hoped that with all the changes in 2018 and the training requirements, that it wouldn't be nearly as big of an issue this past summer as it was in 2017. But unfortunately, it was still quite common. I didn't think we had as many problems in Kansas as we did the previous year. But there were some other states where they felt it was just as big of an issue, if not more of an issue, this past year. And so the original registration was just a 2-year registration. And EPA kind of did that intentionally with the idea that, well, we can reassess and see if we can move forward with it. That expired this last fall. And so they did make a decision, and they decided to renew it for another 2 years, just another 2-year extension of that registration. but even with some additional new requirements from what was implemented in 2018.
And if producers aren't familiar with those additional amendments to the regulations, they surely need to know about those going into 2019 soybean production.
Right. And so, again, as I mentioned, in 2018, it was restricted use. It had to be certified to buy it. You also had to have applicator training if you're going to apply it, but you could apply it without being a certified applicator if you were doing it under direct supervision. They've closed that now. They've clearly stated that you have to be both certified and have applicator training. And again, in 2018, when they had that requirement for training, it wasn't clear if that would be annual training or one-time training or a certain interval. They also clarified that for this year, that it has to be annual training. So you have to be both certified and have annual training. Now, there was a lot of training done in 2018. We were involved with that along with the registrants. The Kansas Department of Ag has indicated that they feel that it is the registrant's responsibility to provide that training. It will have to be acquired through the companies that sell those products. And they've been doing meetings around the state, and there still are a few more scheduled. But probably the best way to find out where those trainings are is to go to their websites. You can also do online training at their websites. And so with your internet search tool, just indicate, dicamba applicator training, or you can go specifically to one of the products, again, say Extendamax applicator training, and it'll take you to their website, and the information should be available there as to what training sessions are being held, or if you want to do the online training, you can go ahead and sign up and do that online at one of their websites.
In addition to the training, Dallas, have there been any alterations in the regulations as far as buffer distances from susceptible crops and the like?
Well, there have been some changes, and from the very beginning, I think there were some misunderstandings about some of those label requirements. Last year, one of the things that they implemented from the previous year is that you could only apply it between sunrise and sunset. They further restricted that this year to the point where now you can only apply it from 1 hour after sunrise until 2 hours before sunset. And that restriction is on there primarily to try and avoid temperature inversions. Yeah. And again, we spend a lot of time trying to educate on temperature inversions. But temperature inversions may be one of the biggest culprits at facilitating non-target movement. They occur usually during the nighttime hours, but they start 1 to 2 hours before sunset, and they oftentimes persist until about 1 hour after sunrise. And they're most common when we have relatively calm conditions. So intuitively, you think, well, it's calm, that's the best time to go out and spray, but at the same time, that's when we can have actually quite a bit of non-target movement in that temperature inversion. So that's one of the biggest ones. And remember, you can only spray when the wind is between 3 and 10 mile an hour. And so, again, you think about your opportunities there.
They could be slim.
They could be slim, right. And especially when the weeds are growing, Palmer amaranth's growing 1 to 2 inches a day during the heat of the growing season, that can be quite a limiting factor. In regards to buffers, there have been one minor change there, but again, I think there's been misunderstanding from the very beginning on the need for buffers and where they're required and that sort of thing. The label states that a buffer is always required in the downwind direction unless you have certain things downwind that can be counted as part of that buffer. And so, again, those exemptions are things like roads in ditches. That can be counted as part of your buffer in that downwind direction, or fields that have not been planted yet, agricultural fields that have not been planted, or fields that are planted to a dicamba-tolerant crop like corn, wheat, sorghum. That's the good thing for us. When you have those in that downwind direction, then you actually don't need a buffer there. On the other hand, if you have a natural area, downwind buffer is always required. And really this is kind of in response to endangered species. Mm-hmm. That buffer is 110 foot for the kind of the standard typical use rate with these products. It can be up to 220 foot with the high use rates of Extendamax and Fexpan in a pre-plant scenario. What the buffer doesn't mean is that you simply need to leave 110 foot between you and a susceptible crop. If a susceptible crop is downwind, i.e. non-extend soybeans, then the label says do not spray if the wind is blowing in the direction of a neighboring or adjacent susceptible crop.
Regardless of speed.
Regardless of wind speed, right. So the question comes up, what does adjacent or neighboring mean, right? That still is not very well defined. What is the safe distance downwind if you have a susceptible crop? Is it a half mile, a mile, 2 miles? Again, that's not clearly stated. That's still up to the discretion of the applicator. But if drift occurs and the wind is blowing in that direction, then you would be out of compliance. So, again, no clear definition on that. But certainly if there's a susceptible crop across the road, whatever, you simply should not spray on that day. You can only spray when the wind is blowing in the other direction.
All of this is covered in the training. Therefore, you should be exposed to this maybe repeatedly, which is with purpose.
Absolutely. And again, there's been a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of other restrictions regarding what spray tips are approved and the clean-out procedures and those sort of things that you need to be aware of before you use one of these products. So the training should cover that. And again, that information is also available on their websites.
Just as a closing thought here, Dallas, if stewardship is practiced in an appropriate way this year with the training, with the certification, and with following through on all of these necessities, can dicamba, the new technologies, be preserved as an option?
Well, that's a good question. And, part of the issue has also been not following those label guidelines. I think really if you are very careful and follow those label guidelines, know what's around you, and that's part of the label requirement too, to know what susceptible crops are around you, hopefully we can minimize that non-target damage and move forward.
Really is all hands on deck with the proper stewardship of these products, and we'll probably be discussing them further on down the line, Dallas. We appreciate the update right here. Thank you.
Very good. My pleasure.
Weed Management Specialist Dallas Peterson, K-State Research and Extension, and what you soybean growers employing the dicamba-resistant technologies need to be thinking of here as we get into the growing season ahead as to how to appropriately manage that product and its application, including the all-important training requirements that will allow you to actually utilize this technology. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome back. And on this segment, raising awareness of a disease concern in winter wheat production in Kansas. And as the crop emerges from dormancy, this is something that you growers may want to be alert to. And moreover, in the years ahead, plan against. It's called wheat stem rust. Erick DeWolf has been discussing this with producers and others over the winter on the meeting circuit. Eric is a wheat disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension, as you know. This is something, in fact, you spoke last week about with the Kansas Crop Improvement Association, the certified seed growers. It's not a new pathogen. It's been around in history anyway.
Absolutely. This is a disease that we know has a long history in our state and in our region throughout the Great Plains of causing some major yield losses. So even when we were looking at moderate outbreaks of the disease, we were still on par with what we currently experience in disease losses to diseases such as stripe rust, which is now our number one disease in the state. So I think this is something that is easy to set aside because we haven't had major problems in some recent years. But if we look back in the not-so-distant past, we can see a long history problems with this disease.
Quickly, the nature of the disease, it's like the other rusts in many respects, stripe rust, leaf rust.
It is a lot like those. It shares a lot of similar biology to these different diseases, and it causes some reddish-brown, rust-colored lesions, as the name implies. But unlike the leaf rust or stripe rust, the stem rust is able to affect the leaf sheaths, and true stems, heads, awns, all the above-ground portions of the plant are susceptible to this disease.
What happened to put it on the back burner, so to say, in times past?
Well, there was major problems with it in the 1940s, 1950s, and then again in 1960s throughout the Great Plains. At that time, in the early 1960s, there was a concerted effort, a major effort throughout the Great Plains to breed for genetic resistance to this disease because it had been so problematic. And they were quite successful. So this is about the same time that we saw what we call the Green Revolution, and we were beginning to introduce the semi-dwarf varieties. It was some of those same highly successful wheat geneticists and breeders that were developing the genetic resistance that has been the foundation of our genetic resistance for more than 40 years now.
So that resistance has endured, and good fortune, or was this a product of good science as well?
Well, I think it's good science, and I think there's some other factors here that also play into this as well. So if you remember some of the biology of these rust diseases, they have what we call some alternate hosts, and in this case, there's a shrub called barberry. Barberry, at the same time, in the 1940s and 50s, there was a major federal effort to eradicate these barberry bushes from many areas of the Great Plains and, in fact, throughout the United States, because this is where that stem rust fungus is able to go in the winter months. But more than just survival, it's actually able to do some genetic recombination on those bushes. And that genetic recombination then results in additional diversity or the ability to overcome genetic resistance. So if we remove that other alternate host, the barberry bushes, we reduce the population's potential to create mutations or variants that can overcome that genetic resistance, introduce a whole new suite of resistance genes, and that combined strategy has been very successful.
So the wheat industry got ahead of this many years ago and has been able to keep it suppressed, stem rust. Now the concerns that modern-day varieties may be developing a vulnerability to it?
Well, it's an interesting case here. This stem rust has been kind of on the back burner for a lot of folks as far as priorities in disease management, and rightly so. We've had major problems with stripe rust that we've talked about, and wheat streak mosaic a few years ago. We have other priorities related to drought and heat stress. So there's a lot of just breeding priorities that are out there. So it's easy to see how something could begin to diminish in its importance within our breeding programs or variety selection. But in this case, I do feel like we've maybe lost sight, maybe a little too much, of some of the importance that the stem rust resistance has played for us. So we're starting to see a group of varieties now that's taking a considerable amount of acres in western Kansas in particular. That is a growing concern of mine, that we have a vulnerability that we just haven't had for more than 40 years.
That's more than one variety. You're saying it's multiple varieties?
It is. So we're looking at around 2009, we just had a one variety. Shortly after that, we had up to two varieties. Currently, as of 2018, we are looking at 7 varieties that are out on considerable acreage. And it looks like the trend is likely to continue based on the varieties that we know were just released out of with multiple breeding programs this last year. So it's not just a single variety. All told, the bottom line here is that we're looking at, I've mentioned considerable acreage, but let me give you a few numbers there. So we're now looking at most areas of western Kansas, eastern Colorado are at least 20% of their acres are now planted to susceptible varieties. So these are fully susceptible varieties, 8s and 9s on our 1 to 9 scale, where 9 is highly susceptible. In some areas, some crop reporting districts, the acreage now exceeds 30% of the acres. Central Kansas is not exempt from this either. There are actually plateauing, it appears, based on the last 2 ag statistics reports of variety use in the state, right around 10%.
names here as far as the variety susceptible?
Well, I think there are multiple entities that are releasing varieties that are involved, but some of it might surprise you if you haven't looked at this. So there's a few Colorado varieties that have gained some real traction in the region, varieties like Bird and Avery. I'm concerned that Langan, also a new one out of Colorado State that looks really promising, is also very vulnerable to this disease as well. We've also seen some varieties out of the Lima grain program. T158 is widely used in parts of western Kansas and also holds the considerable acreage in parts of central Kansas as well. Maybe one that really caught me by surprise is a variety out of the Texas A&M breeding program. TAM 114 is also quite susceptible to this disease as well. With that said, the other important part of this is it's not just Kansas. So it's not just western Kansas, it's not central Kansas. But remember, many of these same varieties that we mentioned are also quite successful in other parts of the central and southern Great Plains as well. So why is that important? Well, it turns out that the southern Great Plains is where these rust diseases often survive the winter and then get established.
Much as stripe rust, much as leaf rust.
That's right. So we experience these with our other rust diseases nearly every year, and stem rust is no exception to that. So in February and March, if this one of these rust diseases starts getting a foothold in that region, population gets out of control, then it's readily moved by storm systems up into the central plains where we're located.
Eric, what should then the wheat grower community be doing in anticipation of this becoming more and more of a problem here in the central and high plains?
Well, I think long term the answer is really going to be variety selection. I think it really is on the seed producers and growers ultimately to pick varieties that have the right genetic package here. There are lots of varieties to choose from that have at least intermediate or high levels of genetic resistance here. Again, this is not a new disease for us. We've been controlling it very effectively with genetic resistance, and those tools are still available to us in some widely adapted and highly successful, high-yielding varieties.
Looking at the crop currently in the ground, though, some vigilance as to it showing up this year as well. You want producers to be on the lookout.
I think so. And, ideally we'd have, just like with our stripe rust, we'd have some early indicators of problems. If we did see stem rust emerging in the region in Texas and Oklahoma, hopefully we'd be able to get the warning out and people could begin to evaluate whether fungicides would be needed to suppress this disease. So I think the good news in the short term is that we could likely use many of the same fungicides that we use to suppress stripe rust or leaf rust would be very effective or excellent options to control stem rust as well. Of course, that comes at a cost, right? So that we're now looking at yet another disease that we'd have to be monitoring for, another genetic vulnerability we have to manage with these additional input costs of requiring fungicides.
This is, though, attracting enough attention that you think that there's likely to be a renewed emphasis on genetic resistance to stem rust in the breeding programs ahead?
Well, I hope so. And I guess I'm hoping that the breeding programs regionally will begin to respond and begin to make some selections and elevate this as a priority. I'm hoping that we can begin to address the problem and put some of these very effective resistance genes back in our varieties or have varieties that have that out before we have a major problem with this disease. Heaven knows we have enough problems with wheat diseases in the state. We've actually got this one disease pretty well beat in the corner, if you will, but we're at the risk of letting it back out to cause major problems for us as well.
Keep us posted not only on stem rust, but other disease developments as we see them through the rest of the growing season. Eric, thank you for coming over.
You're welcome.
That's the word on stem rust disease potentially making a return appearance in Kansas and Central Plains winter wheat production. Erick DeWolf is a wheat disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and we'll return with more after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. On over to today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. Significant structural changes must be part of any trade deal with China, and there must also be an enforcement mechanism to ensure China sticks to its commitments. Those are the words of U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer in speaking before a House hearing yesterday. Lighthizer testified before the House Ways and Means Committee, receiving a largely favorable response from lawmakers who generally agreed that China's trade practices, especially forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, and industrial subsidies, remain a major problem for U.S. businesses. Lighthizer stressed that enforceability is key to any agreement, noting that China has made commitments in the past and not followed through on them. Asked if he expected a broad package addressing all of the major issues to emerge in the coming weeks, Lighthizer said he was, quoting here, not foolish enough to think that there's going to be one negotiation that's going to change all the practices of China or our trade relationship with them. An agreement that meets those criteria, he said, could serve as the foundation for further work, but he said, quoting again, much still needs to be done before an agreement is reached, and more importantly, after it is reached. Also in Washington yesterday, lawmakers heard about the state of the farm economy from USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue. The USDA's Gary Crawford reports.
While most of the cameras, microphones, and reporters were at the House Oversight Committee hearing with Mr. Cohen's testimony, down the hall, almost unnoticed, another hearing was going on with another witness.
I come willingly. I thought it was better than being subpoenaed.
Humor from Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue to start his 3-hour-plus hearing in the House Ag Committee room. Hearing title, State of the Farm Economy. Perdue took 4 words to encapsulate it.
It's tough out there.
Perdue reporting farm income only half what it was 5 years ago.
There are very few businesses that can survive that kind of revenue decrease. Most commodity prices have fallen, while global stock levels, due to good growing seasons around the world, have rebounded with several years of record production.
And while cash income has been falling,
farm debt's been rising more rapidly over the last 5 years, increasing by 30%, but fortunately, we're not to the levels of the early 80s.
And he said this new farm bill should help improve the farm economy. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Now, to follow up on that, as observations about financial stress for agricultural producers continue to rise, some economists say the data doesn't show that today's farm economy is in a crisis. A former USDA chief economist, Joe Glauber, along with an economics professor at Montana State University, Vincent Smith, co-authored an op-ed for Dow Jones News Services that challenges the argument that American farmers are facing an economic crisis. In that op-ed piece published on Tuesday, Glauber and Smith challenged media portrayals of farmers struggling to make ends meet, stating, and quoting their op-ed piece here, the plight of American farmers always makes for good copy, even when the facts don't match the rhetoric, and when media reports suggest that farmers are about to face a financial crisis based on 1 or 2 pieces of cherry-picked data, farm interest groups rush to Congress to ask for more subsidies on top of the $20 billion a year already being given to crop growers. Again, that directly from the op-ed piece. The economists claim some farm groups are willing to use hyped information about farm bankruptcies to push arguments for more commodity support. Still, a broader look at economics show there is no crisis, they say. Farm bankruptcies are higher than they were a decade ago, but bankruptcy filings in 2018 were lower than 2010 and 2011, and about the same as those of 2012. The number of farm businesses has remained relatively stable since the 1980s, they note. Now, the Vice President and Omaha Branch Executive for the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, Nathan Kaufman, highlighted bankruptcy data last week at the USDA Agricultural Outlook Forum. Delinquency rates for farmers rising to 4% in 2010, coming off the 08-09 recession. Despite strong farm economy that year, Kaufman pointed out, at the moment delinquency rates are closer to 2%. Kaufman noted that the higher delinquency rates and bankruptcies in 2010 occurred in the middle of the biofuel expansion and growing demand from China. Further, he says more than 700 farmers filed for Chapter 12 bankruptcies in 2010, but that total now is closer to 500 filings today. Next up, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Here's Greg Akagi.
Greg Anderson is joining us. He is a Nebraska producer. He serves on the governing board with the National Biodiesel Board. And in this day and age of what we see with low commodity prices, so much of the benefit for biodiesel is out there, specifically if you see what the return is for the farmer out there.
Absolutely, Greg. Now more than ever, we realize how important biodiesel is to our profitability and the means to being profitable on our U.S. farms. I look at my soybean crop and I look out there and I can see that every field brings value to the tune of $35 to $40 an acre. Just equate it to 63 cents a bushel. The economic studies have shown, and that's a very conservative figure, by the way, that it brings 63 cents per bushel to every soybean bushel that we raise. Just reflect on that for a moment, and as the producer gets his check from the elevator or grain merchandiser or wherever he sells his soybeans, if we were to take 63 cents off of that, it'd be devastating. And so biodiesel is helping underpin those soybean prices, creating demand for soybean oil, which is the big factor in all of this. And if we didn't have biodiesel, we'd be really hurting pretty bad. Especially for MBB only being 25 years old to develop that type of demand. And people think, well, it's 25 years, but it's incredible to what's been going on. It is. Really, the soybean farmers and their checkoff established the biodiesel industry in the United States. As we look back just at the last 10 years, soybean oil into biodiesel production has increased 300%. And we're now using over 7 billion pounds of soybean oil every year to make biodiesel. That equates to about 1/3 of our domestic crush in the United States. And so it shows how, over time, we can continue to build this market even to greater heights. The ability to see the demand continuing to rise because you know those markets and those opportunities are out there. USDA has projected again for 2019 that soybean oil used for biodiesel production will increase once more to about 7.6 billion pounds. And so to think that we're knocking on the door of 8 billion pounds, we're continuing to raise a lot of beans. There's a lot of beans in the carryout. But here's a demand factor for the oil side that is really, really important. And knowing that gives confidence, I think, to people who raise soybeans for a living and can grow, and knowing that this market is really asking for even more. All right. Greg, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Greg. That is Greg Anderson, who is a member of the governing board of the National Biodiesel Board. He's been our guest on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. Greg Akagi there. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, our weekly journey into the world of horticulture as we visit once again with K-State Research and Extension horticultural agent Dennis Patton, who is based in Johnson County, northeast Kansas. Our subject of choice this week, Dennis, is garden soil testing. And this may be more challenging than normal this spring, and we'll talk about why in just a second. But there are, as you've advocated time and again, good reasons for conducting, at least on a semi-regular basis, a soil test in your gardening areas.
That is correct. A soil test to me is like the baseline. It tells you what you need to do when it comes to the fertility schedule of your garden. Without that soil test, it's the old saying, it's like shooting in the dark. You just have no idea what your soil fertility is really like. You can't look at it, you can't smell it, you can't feel it, you can't taste it, and know anything about the soil fertility. The only way to do that is to get a reliable soil test, and that's through your local extension office.
Now, you can look at the purpose for soil testing from two different angles, Dennis, one being to identify nutrient deficiencies, what isn't there, and that soil test will also tell you what is there for purposes of assuring one that they're not over-applying nutrient ahead of and during the growing season.
That's correct. I think when it comes to soil tests, to me the most important part of it is going to be the pH level of the soil, which in the big picture of life, pH regulates the availability of the nutrients to the plant to pick up. So it's either too high or too low. The plant can't utilize what's in the soil. And then the other way to look at it is, like you said, it's not so much to reveal maybe what's there, but maybe to reveal what isn't there when it comes to soil fertility. And then that is the basis for a fertility schedule and what type of fertilizer they use and how much.
The tendency here in Kansas, it's said by the experts, is that we often have enough phosphorus and potassium, and that's where we can get into this over-application issue.
That is correct. Because of the way our soils were formed over millions of years from a lot of limestone, we tend to have a lot of phosphorus, we have a lot of potassium, which are two of the three major nutrients that plants need for growth and development. And the plants do use them, but they're not really lost from the soil. They're bound, they're held in the soil, where nitrogen, that third nutrient, is used up and it also leaches out of the root zone. So yes, to me the most important thing is that soil test in most cases reveals that we have plenty of P and K. We don't really need to add more, which means we're looking then more at a nitrogen-type source of fertilizer for a healthy and vigorous garden.
All right. Well, for the basic soil test then, the mechanics, pulling a sample, it's pretty straightforward, right?
That's correct. What we want to do is take multiple samples from around the garden area. So the bigger the garden area, the more small samples you're going to want to take. Maybe scrape off the upper inch or so of the soil, but then go down 2, 4, 6 inches deep, which is where the root system of those crops are going to be, and maybe pull a half a dozen small samples, put them into a clean bucket or some sort of container, and then mix them all together. And then the university is going to require probably somewhere around 1.5 to 2 cups of soil to be brought into your local extension office to be sent up to the soil testing lab on campus.
And they'll take it from there. They'll look at that composite, turn it around, and then send one back the results. And that readout, if you will cover all of the basics of the content of that soil.
Correct, because what K-State gives back, whether it's the test is interpreted by your local county extension agent or at the university level, they really do a nice job in the vegetable world because it'll give you exactly what type of fertilizers you need to use, the analysis, and will also give you the rate at which those need to be applied per either 100 or 1,000 square feet of your garden, and will also give you the timing. So you've got really the recipe, if you will, for how to fertilize that garden based on that soil test. So you almost want to say it's tailored for you, which for a very low fee, which the university charges, is a pretty good deal.
Now, Dennis, as you and everyone else would be well aware, soils have been really soaked up this winter, and the opportunity to take a soil test in dry conditions may be, fleeting. So can a soil test be taken when the conditions are a bit on the damp side?
You know, the soil test can, from the university standpoint, they dry them thoroughly before they actually do the analysis. So the moisture doesn't really bother us on our end, but the problem is you don't want to get out there and sink to your knees in mud and tromp through the garden. It's going to destroy the structure of your soil. So to me, it's more physically when you can get out there in that soil and pull those cores, those plugs, and get a good sample more so than whether it's too wet or not to send in. So it's more about just practicality, in my mind, in getting the sample itself.
If it's wet but not overly wet, though, one could go ahead and dry their own samples if they wished before submitting them for analysis, right?
They could, yeah. They could get that, put in that bucket and just leave it lay out, in a dry, warm area for a few days to dry up. And then, of course, they can kind of break it up so it doesn't become one big dirt clod, which tends to happen here in Kansas with our clay soils, and then bring that sample into the university itself. And most samples get turned around in most counties in 2 weeks or less, depending on the backup. Of course, this time of year when it's been so wet and cold, there's not a lot of soil samples going in the university at this point in time.
Right. If you are going to dry your own sample, though, you want to use air drying and not an artificial drying device.
Yeah. Don't put in your oven. Don't put in your microwave. Just lay out on a table or somewhere that it will dry on its own in a couple of days. And like I said, really, we want it to be dry just so we don't have all that shipping weight of moisture. But I wouldn't worry about it too much unless you're just bringing us in, a clay ball or our soup, and then we really can't handle that wet of a sample.
Well, here we are knocking on the door of the month of March, and home gardeners will be itching to get after it as soon as possible with their various vegetable and or ornamental plantings. So once the conditions allow, one can go ahead and get this taken care of, Dennis.
That's right. It's one of those great winter tasks, even though we're moving into spring. It's one of those great winter tasks to get it done and kind of check it off the do list so you can get to the real fun of gardening, which is planting those crops coming up here in the next couple of weeks. And usually we need to test our soil maybe every 3 to 5 years just to monitor changes, those type of things that do happen in the soil.
And once more, as Dennis notes, you can gain all sorts of assistance on how to submit a soil test from your local extension personnel. They'll be more than happy to help you out with that. Dennis, always appreciate the input. Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.
He's the Johnson County Extension Horticultural Agent, Dennis Patton, on the basics of drawing and submitting a soil test from your gardening areas as we eventually roll into the growing season here in Kansas. Dennis featured on this week's K-State Horticulture segment. Our time's away for today, and we appreciate you once again tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.